Harold walked slowly down the quiet street that morning, his steps steady but heavy with age. He wore his old army jacket, the one he had kept carefully folded for years, only bringing it out on days that felt important. Today was one of those days. The town was holding a small memorial for veterans in the central square, and Harold wanted to be there. For him, it was not about the speeches or the flags. It was about remembering the men he had served with, the brothers he had lost far away from home, and the sacrifices that still lived in his heart. The sun was shining, and the streets were alive with people preparing for the event. Families were walking with children, veterans in wheelchairs were being helped by their loved ones, and a few groups stood chatting near the park. Harold carried himself with quiet dignity. His hair was gray, his shoulders a little bent, but his presence was calm and strong. He had seen enough in life to understand patience. He had seen worse than unkind words, worse than fear, worse than loneliness. He had fought for his country, and even though his body was weaker now, his spirit was unbroken. As he reached the edge of the park, Harold noticed a few young men watching him. They whispered to one another, smirking at his jacket. He heard one of them mutter something about old soldier. Harold didn't react. He had learned long ago that not every voice deserved an answer. He kept walking with his head held high. But then, something unexpected happened. A police officer, tall and sharp in his uniform, stepped out from a corner near a patrol car. He looked at Harold in a way that was not friendly. This officer had a reputation in town. People whispered about him being quick-tempered, proud, and sometimes unfair. His name was Officer Miller. Many avoided crossing his path. Miller's eyes narrowed as he looked at Harold's jacket and then at his face. He said loudly enough for others to hear, "What are you doing here, old man? Trying to play hero again?" The crowd nearby grew quiet. Some turned their heads, uneasy but unwilling to get involved. Harold stopped, surprised but still calm. He answered softly, "I came for the memorial, like everyone else." The officer laughed in a cold way, then reached behind him and pulled out a small spray can used for marking. It was bright orange paint. He shook it and smirked. Before Harold could move, before anyone could even understand what was about to happen, the officer pressed down on the nozzle and sprayed a thick line of paint right across Harold's hair and forehead. The orange liquid dripped down his face, staining his skin and jacket. Gasps rose from the bystanders. A woman covered her mouth with her hands. A man took out his phone and started recording. Children stared wide-eyed at the shocking scene. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The old veteran stood still with orange paint running down his face. He didn't shout, didn't push, didn't curse. He simply looked at the officer with tired eyes that carried years of pain and patience. The officer grinned as if he had won some battle. "Now everyone will know you're marked," he said in a mocking tone. He thought the crowd would laugh with him. He thought people would be too scared to speak. But the crowd only stared in silence, their unease growing heavier by the second. Harold closed his eyes briefly. He thought of the battlefield long ago, where he had been surrounded by explosions and fear but had kept moving forward. Compared to that, this moment was small, but it cut deep in a different way. This was his home. This was the country he had protected. And now, standing in the middle of a town square, he was being humiliated not by an enemy, but by one of the very men sworn to protect justice. Yet Harold did not raise his voice. He straightened his shoulders even as the paint dripped down his cheek. His silence carried more weight than anger ever could. He had endured bullets, storms, hunger, and loss. A line of orange paint could not take away his honor. Around him, people began to whisper. One young man muttered, "This isn't right." Another whispered, "Someone should stop him." But still no one moved. Fear held them back. They had seen what this officer could do, and none of them wanted to become the next target. Harold looked at the crowd, then back at the officer. His voice was low, steady, almost too calm for the moment. "I fought for this country," he said softly. "I wore this jacket when I stood side by side with men who never made it home. I didn't think I'd live to see this day." The words fell heavy on the air. A few people lowered their eyes in shame. Some shifted uncomfortably, knowing they should step forward but not finding the courage. The officer, feeling the silence press against him, laughed again to hide his discomfort. He waved the can of paint in the air and said, "Don't give me speeches, old man. You're nothing special, just another has-been." But in his heart, Harold was unmoved. His dignity was not something anyone could strip away with paint or words. He stood tall, the orange on his head like a crown of quiet suffering, and looked straight ahead. What nobody knew at that moment was that someone very important was walking toward the square. A tall figure, younger but with the same calm strength in his eyes, was making his way through the crowd. He had heard the commotion and he had seen the people pointing. He was Harold's son David, a man who had built his life around justice and truth. And the sight of his father standing humiliated under the bright morning sun was about to change everything. But for now, the square remained still, the tension thick, the paint dripping slowly onto Harold's jacket. The scene was one of injustice and silence, but beneath the quiet surface something powerful was about to rise. Harold stood there with paint dripping down his forehead, but his heart did not shake. He had seen many moments of humiliation in his life, but this one carried a heavy silence. The officer expected him to lash out, to shout in anger, to break down like a weak man, but Harold refused to give him that satisfaction. He kept his back straight, and even though his eyes burned, his voice stayed calm. He remembered his time in the service, the nights when bombs had lit up the sky, when hunger gnawed at his stomach, when the fear of not seeing the next sunrise was real. Compared to those nights, this was a small wound, yet it was a wound that hurt the soul more than the body. He fought for freedom, for dignity, for a nation that now watched him in silence. The people in the square shifted uncomfortably. Some had their phones raised, recording every second, but no one dared to step forward. A young woman whispered to her friend, "He's a veteran." How could he do that to him? A man in a suit shook his head and muttered, "This is going to end badly for the officer." Still, nobody intervened. Fear held them still. Harold's hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of memory. He thought of his brothers in arms, men of all races standing shoulder to shoulder in the battlefield. Out there, no one cared about skin color. They only cared if you had their back, if you could be trusted to fight beside them. And now, in the land he had returned to, someone in a uniform, the very symbol of law, had marked him as less than human. The officer stood smugly, shaking the spray can like it was a trophy. He spoke louder for the crowd to hear. "See this? This is what happens when you step where you don't belong." He expected laughter, but the silence only grew heavier. He misread that silence, thinking it was fear that confirmed his power. Harold slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth handkerchief. He wiped his face carefully, his motions unhurried, as if the act of wiping away the paint was also wiping away the officer's attempt to shame him. He folded the stained cloth neatly and put it back in his pocket. Then he lifted his eyes to the sky for a brief moment, whispering something only he could hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a word to the fallen brothers he remembered. His calmness unsettled some in the crowd. An elderly woman stepped closer, her hands clenched. She wanted to say something, but her husband pulled her arm gently, whispering, "Don't, you'll get in trouble." Fear kept many quiet, but respect for Harold grew stronger in their hearts. The officer didn't stop. He circled Harold like a man trying to prove his control. "You think wearing that jacket makes you someone? It's just old fabric. You're not a hero anymore, just another man past his time." His words stung, not because Harold believed them, but because they revealed the officer's ignorance. Harold let out a slow breath. "That jacket," he said softly, "was worn when men stood against death, when friends fell beside me, and when I came home with scars you can't see." His voice carried across the square. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, and the truth in it made people's chests tighten. Some bystanders lowered their phones, ashamed they had done nothing but record. Others kept filming, sensing that something bigger was unfolding, something that would not stay hidden. And then, from the edge of the square, footsteps echoed. A tall figure in a dark suit walked quickly through the crowd. His stride was firm, his expression unreadable. People moved aside as he came closer, and soon the orange paint on Harold's head came into his view. It was David, Harold's son. He had been on his way to join his father for the memorial, but the murmurs and the sight of people holding up their phones had caught his attention. When he pushed past the last group of onlookers and saw his father standing there, marked and humiliated, his breath caught in his throat. For a split second, David froze. Anger surged inside him, but he did not let it control his face. He was a lawyer, a man of the law, trained to use words and knowledge as weapons. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice sharp yet calm. "What did you just do to my father?" The officer turned, surprised. He didn't expect anyone to challenge him so directly, especially not someone who carried himself with the quiet authority David did. The crowd stirred, sensing that the moment was shifting. Harold looked at his son with pride, though his eyes carried sadness too. He had hoped David would not have to see him in this state, but perhaps it was meant to be this way. The square was no longer silent. Murmurs spread quickly. Phones turned toward David now. The son of the man who had been humiliated was stepping into the circle, and everyone felt the weight of change coming. David moved closer to his father, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. He pulled out his phone, already dialing a number. His voice was steady, controlled, but filled with a quiet fire that no one could ignore. And in that moment, the officer who once looked untouchable began to feel the ground shift beneath his feet. The crowd leaned forward, waiting, sensing that something powerful was about to unfold. The dignity of the old man and the arrival of his son had turned the tide. What happened next would shock everyone. David stood beside his father with calm strength, his tall frame a silent shield against the officer who had dared to humiliate an old man who had once carried a nation's flag on his back. The paint on Harold's head still glistened in the morning sun, but the mood in the square had shifted. The crowd that once stood frozen now leaned forward, drawn by the tension, by the unspoken promise that the quiet man in the suit was about to change everything. David looked at his father first. He placed a hand gently on Harold's shoulder, his eyes full of respect. "Dad, are you all right?" he asked softly. Harold nodded, his lips pressed together, not trusting his voice to hold steady. He didn't want his son to see weakness. He had never let him see it before, not when times were hard, not when nights were long, and certainly not now. Then David turned his gaze to the officer. His eyes were calm, but there was a fire behind them, the kind of fire that came not from uncontrolled anger, but from deep conviction. "What gives you the right," he asked firmly, "to treat my father like this?" His voice rang through the square. It wasn't shouted, but it was strong enough that every person nearby heard it. The officer straightened, surprised at the question being asked so directly. For a moment he tried to regain control. "Stay back," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear that had begun to rise in his chest. "It concerns me more than anyone," David replied steadily. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. Opening it, he revealed his legal badge. "My name is David Carter. I am an attorney, and this man," he gestured toward Harold, "is not just my client, he is my father, a decorated veteran of the United States Army." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The whispers grew louder. Phones that had been lowered were lifted higher again, recording every word. The people who had been hesitant moments ago now seemed braver, hiding their growing courage behind the screens of their devices. They knew they were witnessing a moment that would not stay in this square but would travel far beyond it. The officer scoffed, but his posture wasn't as confident as before. "So what? He's just another man. Don't try to play games with me." David's tone didn't waver. "You just committed assault against a veteran in front of dozens of witnesses. You humiliated a man who wore the uniform, who served with honor, and you did it for your own amusement. Do you realize how serious this is?" The crowd began nodding, murmurs of agreement spreading. A woman spoke up from the side. "He's right. I saw it with my own eyes." Another man, still filming, shouted, "We all saw it." "You sprayed him for no reason." The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the cameras around him. David took a step forward, his voice steady and controlled. "You think power means humiliating the weak? My father has faced more powerful enemies than you will ever know. He has stared death in the eye and kept walking. He does not fear you, and neither do I." The officer tried to respond, but David cut him off with sharp precision. "What is your badge number? Say it clearly for everyone here to hear. Or shall I call your supervisor myself?" He held up his phone, showing that he was already connected on a call. The faint sound of a dispatcher's voice came through. The crowd grew restless, some beginning to cheer quietly. For the first time, the officer's arrogance began to fade. He realized the moment was slipping from his control. His authority, once backed by fear, was crumbling under the weight of truth and the presence of a son who refused to let injustice pass. Harold stood silently beside his son, his pride swelling though his heart still ached. He never asked for his son to fight his battles. He had always tried to protect him from the ugliness of the world. Yet in this moment he understood something profound. It was no longer his role to shield his son. It was his son's time to stand for him. And he had never felt more grateful. David spoke again, his words sharp but respectful. Every witness here has seen what you've done. Every camera has recorded it. You may think you can bury this, but the truth is already spreading. This uniform is not a weapon. It is a responsibility. And today you have failed it. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of truth. The officer's face turned red, his hand gripping the spray can as if it were the last piece of control he had. But the crowd was no longer afraid of him. They had shifted, their loyalty moving quietly to Harold and David. One older man in the crowd, himself a veteran with medals pinned to his chest, pushed forward and spoke loudly. This man deserves respect. He carried a rifle so that you could wear that badge. And this is how you treat him? His voice trembled with anger. The crowd clapped, the sound small at first but then growing louder. The officer's confidence cracked. He looked around, realizing that no one was on his side. The silence he once enjoyed was gone, replaced by voices rising against him. David's eyes never left the officers. "Step back," he said firmly. "Your actions will be reported. You will answer for what you've done." The officer opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of sirens in the distance cut through the air. Heads turned as another police car approached the square. The sound grew louder, and the officer's posture sagged. He knew what it meant. David slipped his phone back into his pocket. He had already spoken to the higher authorities. Help was on the way, and the weight of justice was about to fall. Harold looked at his son, his voice finally breaking through the moment. "David," he said softly, "I didn't want you to see this." David turned, his expression softening for the first time. "Dad," he said gently, "I needed to see this, and the world needed to see you. Not as a victim, but as the man you've always been. Strong, dignified, unbroken." The words wrapped around Harold's heart like a blanket. He felt tears press at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He only nodded. The crowd cheered louder now, sensing that justice was close. The officer shifted nervously as the approaching sirens grew nearer. The old man and his son stood side by side, their quiet strength filling the square. What had started as a moment of humiliation was transforming into something much bigger, a reckoning. And within moments, the entire town would witness the turning point. The crowd grew tense as the sound of sirens came closer. People who had been quiet before were now whispering and pointing. Some were angry, some were nervous, but everyone knew they were watching something important. Harold stood tall beside his son, paint still dripping from his head, his jacket stained. He had not raised his hand or shouted once, but the weight of his silence had been louder than any outburst. And now, with his son beside him, the moment was shifting. The officer's smirk had already faded. He gripped the can of orange paint tightly, but his eyes darted around the square as if searching for a way out. The authority he once believed he had was slipping away, replaced by unease. David's calm but firm words had pierced through his confidence like a knife. He had thought humiliating an old man would make him look powerful, but instead it had made him look small in front of everyone. The first police car pulled up at the edge of the park. A supervisor stepped out, followed by another officer. Their expressions were serious, their eyes moving quickly from Harold to the younger officer holding the spray can. The square grew quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that waits for judgment. David stepped forward, his voice carrying steady authority. "Thank you for coming. This man," he pointed toward the officer, "assaulted my father in full view of this community. My father is a decorated veteran. He has served this country with honor, and yet he was humiliated for no reason other than pride and prejudice. I want his actions noted clearly." The supervisor glanced at Harold, then at the orange streaks on his head and jacket. His jaw tightened. He turned toward the crowd. "Did anyone witness this?" Immediately, voices rose. "I saw it. I have it on video. He sprayed him right in the face for no reason." Dozens of phones lifted higher, screens glowing with recorded evidence. The officer shifted uneasily, realizing the truth could not be denied. The supervisor's eyes hardened. "Officer Miller," he said sharply, "put the can down." For a moment, the younger officer hesitated, his pride struggling to let go. But under the weight of the eyes staring at him, he finally lowered the can and set it on the ground. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. David's voice broke the silence again. This uniform should stand for protection, not humiliation. My father wore a different uniform, one that carried a different kind of risk, one that protected the very freedoms we stand on. You will not dishonor that. The crowd broke into applause. It started with a few claps, then grew until the sound filled the square. The officer stood frozen, red-faced, his arrogance fully stripped away. Harold, however, remained calm. He did not cheer, did not smile. He only placed a hand gently on his son's arm, as if to say, "You've done enough." But in his eyes, pride glowed brighter than any medal he had ever received. The supervisor stepped closer to Harold. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I'm truly sorry for what happened. This is not who we are, and this will not go unanswered." He gestured to the other officer. "Escort him." The crowd gasped as Officer Miller was guided away. His head was lowered, his step stiff, and for the first time since the morning began, Harold felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. Justice, in some form, had finally stepped forward, but David wasn't finished. He looked around at the crowd and raised his voice. "My father's story is not just his own. It is the story of many who have served, who have given, and who still return home only to be treated as less than what they are. We cannot let this pass quietly. Every man and woman who has carried this country deserves respect." The people cheered again, louder this time, some with tears in their eyes. A veteran in the crowd raised his cane and shouted, "Amen to that." Others clapped until their palms stung. Harold felt something stir in his chest. He had lived a long life, seen war, loss, and hardship. But this moment, standing with his son as voices rose for him, was unlike anything else. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "I thought my fight ended years ago. I didn't know it would continue like this." David heard him and turned, speaking low so only his father could hear. "Your fight ended, Dad, but today you gave us a lesson. You showed us what true strength looks like, not in fists, not in anger, but in dignity." The supervisor spoke again, promising an internal review and assuring Harold that Miller's actions would not be ignored. The crowd clapped once more, their energy feeding off one another, united in their outrage but also in their respect for the old man who had carried himself with so much grace. Slowly, David pulled a small cloth from his pocket and wiped his father's forehead. The orange paint smeared but began to fade. He did it gently, carefully, like a son who wanted to erase not just the stain but the pain behind it. The crowd watched silently, touched by the tenderness of the act. A woman in the front whispered, "That's love. That's real strength," another man nodded. "He fought for us. Now his son fights for him. That's how it should be." As the paint disappeared, the old army jacket Harold wore seemed to shine brighter, not because of the cloth itself, but because of what it symbolized. To the crowd, it was no longer just an old jacket. It was a reminder of sacrifice, honor, and the quiet strength of a man who never asked for thanks, only respect. The turning point had come. What started as an act of humiliation had transformed into a moment of truth. The officer who thought he was powerful had been revealed for what he was, and the man he tried to shame had become a symbol of dignity. The event that day was meant to honor veterans, but no speech, no flag, no parade could have honored them more than what the people had just witnessed. A father standing silent in dignity, a son standing tall in defense, a community rising to its feet, united by justice. And yet, as the cheers settled and the crowd slowly began to calm, Harold knew the journey was not over. The paint might be gone from his skin, but the stain of what had happened would live in memory. Whether that memory became a scar or a spark depended on what came next. For Harold, the moment wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching the people around him, especially the younger ones, that real strength does not come from violence or from humiliating others. It comes from holding your head high when the world tries to bow it down. And as the crowd began to chant his name, softly at first and then louder, Harold stood straighter. He did not ask for this moment, but it had found him. And through his silence and his son's voice, he had shown everyone that dignity will always outshine hate. The square was no longer filled with shame. It was filled with respect, and everyone present would carry that memory for the rest of their lives. The square slowly returned to calm after the loud clapping and shouting, but the air still carried a heavy feeling. People had come to honor veterans that day, but they had witnessed something none of them would ever forget. Harold stood in the middle of the crowd, his jacket stained, his forehead freshly wiped by his son. His silence had spoken louder than anger ever could, and his son's strong words had made the truth impossible to ignore. The officer who caused it all was no longer standing tall. He had been escorted away, and the sight of him leaving with his head down had sent a message stronger than any punishment. For the first time, the people saw that arrogance and cruelty could be broken not by fists, but by dignity and truth. David stayed beside his father. He wasn't smiling in victory. He wasn't celebrating. His face was calm, serious, and full of respect. He knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about the man who had carried him as a boy, who had taught him right from wrong, who had fought for a country that didn't always fight for him. A woman walked up slowly, holding her young son's hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, thank you. My boy just saw what real strength looks like. He won't forget it." Harold looked at the boy, who stared at him with wide, curious eyes. He bent slightly, smiled gently, and said, "Always treat people with respect, son. No matter who they are. That's the real strength." The boy nodded, squeezing his mother's hand tightly. Other people stepped forward too. Some shook Harold's hand. Some simply placed a hand on his shoulder. Others just looked at him with eyes full of apology and respect. They had watched. They had stayed silent at first, but now they wanted him to know they stood with him. Harold accepted it quietly, not with pride, but with grace. The supervisor, who had stayed to manage the situation, finally spoke. "Mr. Carter, we will be filing a full report. What was done to you will not be hidden. I promise you that." Harold nodded but didn't answer. He didn't care about punishment for the officer as much as he cared about the lesson that had just been given to the people. David, however, spoke clearly. "I will personally make sure this is followed through, not just for my father, but for every man or woman who has been treated unjustly." His words carried like a promise, and the people listening knew he meant it. The memorial event finally began, though it felt different now. When Harold was invited forward, the crowd clapped louder than ever. Not because he had medals pinned to his chest, but because they had seen his character that morning. They had seen him humiliated, and they had seen him rise above it with more dignity than any of them could have imagined. As Harold stood before the flag, the paint almost completely cleaned from his head. He felt tears pressing at the corners of his eyes. He thought of his old friends, men who had not come home, men who never got to stand in a square like this again. He whispered their names in his heart and hoped they knew he still carried them with him. David stood behind him, proud but quiet. He thought of all the times his father had gone without so he could have more. He thought of the nights his father had worked long hours, never complaining, just to give him an education. And now here they were, standing side by side, not as just father and son, but as two men bound by truth and respect. The crowd rose to its feet as Harold saluted the flag, his hand steady even with age. The sound of clapping filled the air again, but this time it was mixed with something more: admiration, love, and deep gratitude. When the ceremony ended, people didn't leave right away. Many stayed to speak to Harold. Some shared stories of their own parents who had served. Others confessed how ashamed they felt for not stepping forward sooner. Harold listened kindly to each one, never judging, only reminding them that silence could be broken if they chose to stand together in the future. Later that day, as the square emptied, Harold and David walked slowly toward their car. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The same color that had once stained Harold's head now seemed softer, like the day itself was reminding him that pain could be turned into beauty. David opened the car door for his father. "You did more today than I ever could have in a courtroom," he said quietly. Harold chuckled, shaking his head. "No, son. You did what I couldn't. You spoke when I chose silence. That balance. That's what made the difference." As they sat together, Harold finally let his shoulders relax. "I never wanted you to see me like that," he admitted. "But maybe it was meant to be. Maybe people needed to see how we handle hate with dignity." David looked at him with eyes full of love. "Dad, you've always been my example. Today you showed everyone what I've known all my life. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You don't have to strike back to win. You just have to stand tall." Harold smiled softly, his heart at peace. The orange stain was gone from his skin, but the memory of the day would never fade. It would not be remembered as the day he was humiliated. It would be remembered as the day a community saw what true honor looked like. News of the event spread quickly in the days that followed. Videos posted online were shared thousands of times. People who had never met Harold now knew his story. Messages of respect and support poured in, not just from the town but from far beyond. Veterans groups reached out, calling him a symbol of quiet strength. Younger people shared his words with their friends, saying, "This is how you fight back with dignity." The officer who had caused it all faced consequences, but Harold rarely spoke about him again. For Harold, the lesson wasn't about punishment. It was about teaching people to look deeper, to see the humanity in each other, and to stand against injustice without losing their own character. One evening, Harold sat on his porch with David beside him. The world was quiet except for the sound of crickets. He looked at his son and said, "Do you know what shocked me most that day? It wasn't what that officer did. It was what you did. You reminded me that my fight lives on in you. That's how I know everything I gave wasn't wasted." David placed a hand over his father's and smiled. "And I'll carry it forward, Dad. Always." The stars appeared slowly in the night sky, and Harold leaned back in his chair, feeling the peace of knowing he had lived long enough to see the next generation take up the torch. The day had started with humiliation, but it ended with hope. And in the heart of every person who witnessed it, the image of an old man standing tall with paint dripping from his head, and a son by his side turning the tide, remained forever. It was no longer just Harold's story. It had become a lesson for everyone. Dignity cannot be erased, honor cannot be painted over, and love between a father and son can change the course of a moment, a crowd, and even a community. And in that truth, Harold found peace.